That it's been 5 years since the Loud House's Halloween special Tricked had premiered on Nickelodeon. It's really accurate to not only review this episode for its 5th anniversary, but also comparing it to the Casagrandes Halloween episode that was premiered on Nickelodeon just last year. Unlike the last time, Phantom Freakout is the superior haunted episode compared to the Loud House's Ghost, this episode, Curse of the Candy Goblin, is nowhere near as good as Tricked. Not because of the fact that there was so much effort put into Tricked, but considering that Tricked was part of the golden age of the Loud House where it's down to earth. This is also the episode the fantasy elements do not work whatsoever for the Casagrandes, unlike Phantom Freakout. Granted, I could make the argument that Tricked isn't one of the best Halloween episodes when it comes to cartoons in general, but comparing it to Curse of the Candy Goblin, it's further proof that the people who've written the Casagrandes episode clearly didn't put any execution on the characters. Unlike Tricked, the characters really had a moment to shine, which really made this one of the most underrated Halloween episodes I've seen, not to mention one of the most original ideas centering around bullies, which I've mentioned in my Lincoln Loud video, who completely stole everyone else's candy in Royal Woods, which completely ruins everyone else's holiday while Lincoln and Clyde are trying to do something about it. When it comes to the Casagrandes, it's still all about candy, but considering that this leads to the characters doing selfish desires, it's difficult to root for them completely. I gotta be honest with you, there are times where the Casagrandes characters, regardless if they're likable, can be really unlikable at certain cases. For me personally, these are the type of issues that really drags this spin-off down to where people are just not seeing this show as its own thing compared to the Loud House, and I can totally understand where people are coming from. Like, if I'm gonna be perfectly honest, episodes like these are one of the examples onto why the Casagrandes came to an end. Like, I wish that there were more episodes and ideas of the characters, but considering that this spin-off is just being a spin-off and nothing else, it's further proof that I shouldn't take spin-offs seriously nowadays. Because to be real with you, regardless if some of the episodes are good in their own way, they're not on the same level as good compared to the Loud House, and regardless if there are episodes that are better than the Loud House, mainly the Greenhouse episode, it doesn't change the fact that whenever I see this episode in particular, all I can think of is it could have been much more better than what we ended up getting, which could instantly make this episode just as good as the Loud House's Tricked. Before I get into one of the biggest positives of this episode, I need to address Lincoln and Clyde's motivation in this episode. It's really so weird to think that these are the two characters who figure out that everyone else's Halloween in Royal Woods has become the worst due to the two bullies just ruining everyone else's Halloween by stealing their candy. Like, you can argue that it did happen in other Halloween episodes in other shows, but whenever I look at this episode in particular, they're trying to take Halloween much more seriously, regardless if it's mostly for younger children. And considering that Lincoln and Clyde are both 11 in this episode, to the point that regardless if they were keeping the candies to themselves until the very end of this episode, but willing to save everyone else's Halloween by also using the haunted maze, which is by Lincoln's house, is honestly good writing if you really look into this episode much more closely. Granted, there are other episodes that have unique Halloween plots, but whenever I look at this episode, it really feels like that they were planning to do a interesting Halloween episode centering around Lincoln and his family, and it's also one of the perfect examples of Lincoln relying on his family a lot more, as long as he just saves everyone during the holiday of Halloween. And considering that Halloween used to be a holiday that I used to enjoy, but found somewhat overglorified, this episode is basically a good episode for people who really enjoys Halloween. But when it comes to Curse of the Candy Goblin, it's nearly every single character for themselves just to get candy from neighbors all over across town, and so on. You know, whenever I see Ryan in this scenario, I honestly expect her to do something completely different than Lincoln, not doing something like every other child would do. I mean, if you compare the Ryan in the earlier seasons and witnessing that she is just basically a female version of Lincoln, it just makes me question, why can't we just have a gender swap show of the Lighthouse instead of the Casagrandes if we're going to get episodes like this? And I'm being completely honest with you whenever I look at these characters being portrayed like this. The fact that they want all the candy from the jar from every single neighbor to the point that they were extremely greedy compared to the other characters who actually put some effort into gaining the candy, then let me tell you, this is further proof that I'm mostly glad that these characters got what they deserved by completely relinquishing all the candy to the Candy Goblin. Seriously, Lola, Lana, and Lisa were really clever on trying to figure out different strategies to get candy, and they were not being selfish completely, especially Lola. If you ask me, I'm pretty sure that they were originally going to have these characters fight over candy, but considering that this could lead to another consequences for these characters, or not at all, then I'm pretty sure that these characters will probably relinquish their candy at the end of the episode, just like Lincoln and Clyde did when they're trying to hide their candy from anyone. It's almost like that they don't even want to top the moment where Lily is actually the baby kangaroo of Lisa's Halloween costume. If you ask me, there is no topping this moment no matter what. Especially that it's probably one of Lily's best moments in the entire show. And speaking of babies, Carlitos in the Casagrandes wants to go trick-or-treating with the other characters. But considering that he's too long, he isn't able to go until next year. To give this episode credit, this is literally the biggest difference between two episodes. Well, the Lighthouse's Halloween episode has Lily as a baby tagging along, while Carlitos as a baby isn't. And considering that he's mostly behind the whole Candy Goblin fiasco that these characters have went through, I can instantly tell for a fact that he pretty much got them back completely, even though that he wasn't fully aware of the fact that these characters were fighting against each other for candy. It is somewhat clever that Carlitos, with the assistance of Sergio, managed to disguise themselves as the Candy Goblin for the sake of getting the candy from the family. But in all honesty, it really feels like that without this somewhat interesting mystery that we witnessed towards the end of the episode, then I can guarantee you that this episode would have been generic of the whole Candy Goblin just stealing candy and people are just going to question if this Candy Goblin is real or not, Paranormal Activity style. You know, if the bullies were dressed up as the Candy Goblin in this for the sake of stealing everyone else's candy, it will probably make this episode, mainly the Lighthouse is Tricked, a lot less interesting and less good of a Halloween episode than it always is. Which I'm mostly thankful that they actually just have the bullies just be bullies instead of just being in the disguise to scare people for the sake of stealing the Halloween candy. Let me tell you, the fact that these two bullies are willing to steal everyone else's candy for themselves, all the while just ruining Halloween in probably the most vile way possible, is a lot more vile compared to ruining someone else's Halloween dress or just humiliating them in front of everyone during this holiday. Because whenever I think about it, it really shows that this episode is where the Loud House were at their prime, regardless if this was around the time where Chris Savino got fired. And even though that this episode was around that time, it was still the month of Halloween, so I don't consider this as bad timing whatsoever. And since that this also led to Lucy's maze being cancelled due to so many trick-or-treaters not being in the neighborhood due to the bullies, then you can really tell that Lincoln and Clyde are the real heroes of Halloween in this episode. And so is Lincoln's family, of course. As for the curse of the Candy Goblin, it's really difficult to think that there isn't a single character who is sane and completely aware of the fact that there was a sign where you can only take one Halloween candy and nothing else, or nothing more, which is the opposite of what these characters were doing, which results the Candy Goblin to hunt them down. I need to be real with you, it's really difficult to see these characters down to earth, even though there are some aspects that they're all down to earth, but compared to the Loud House, they somewhat make the Loud House's characters somewhat redeemable, even though that they were really at their worst in some cases. I just don't understand this. Like, characters like Carlota, Carlos, Bobby, and maybe CJ is somewhat understandable, but the fact that Ryan is part of the not thinking clearly and having second thoughts about anything of what's going to happen makes me lose some sort of respect of Ryan's character. I get it. This is supposed to be a Halloween episode, and you shouldn't take the episode seriously for being a Halloween episode. But in all honesty, the fact that Lincoln did a smart decision in the Halloween episode compared to Ryan is really saying something. It's honestly shocking that Lincoln is a much more better character than Ryan in these types of episodes. Because if you ask me if Lincoln was Ryan in this, then this Halloween episode would have happened in the later seasons of The Loud House, not in the earlier seasons where the characters were down to earth. Whenever I see Ryan in this episode, all I can see is a completely different character. Like, it's great that Ryan isn't a bully anymore, but the way I see it, it really feels like that she is a completely different character, that she isn't representing herself. And I'm being really, really serious whenever I came up with that assumption, whenever I look at Ryan in episodes like these. I guess the only problem of this episode from some fans is the fact that the Loud Sisters don't do anything aside from doing the maze that Lucy set up. Granted, if the Loud Sisters did tag along with Lincoln when it comes to trick-or-treating and the encountered bullies, I'm pretty sure that they wouldn't do anything, and I can guarantee you that this would have been Curse of the Candy Goblin before Curse of the Candy Goblin became a Casagrandes episode 4 years later. When it comes to the rest of the characters who aren't trick-or-treating, mainly the grown adults, they're at the store that they work at, which is under their apartments, and they're basically doing what the Loud Sisters were doing in the Tricked episode, except that one of the characters, Vito, arrives in his original costume, and the majority of the subplot is Vito in his costume being stuck at the door while the other characters are trying to push or pull him out of there. You know, I can understand that this is the type of stuff that happens in real life, But if this is literally the best of what the writers can do for these characters, then it's really saying something. I need to be real with you. I didn't find any enjoyment in this subplot whatsoever, since that it's only there for filler, and unlike the subplot from the Loud House, this really didn't get me invested completely, knowing forward that these characters are fully aware that there is no Candy Goblin, and the fact that they are assuming that their children are completely over-exaggerating. If this episode expects me to believe that these adults are fully aware that the kids are exaggerating due to seeing something that they know isn't real, they may have reminded that they witnessed a ghost chicken because of Sergio completely messing with them, along with stealing his money, his glasses, and also pooping on his car. Yeah, this entire show, along with the Loud House's world building, is becoming a lot more dysfunctional the more I look at it. I'm starting to convince that these characters are doing these decisions for the sake for the plot to move forward, and for me personally, it doesn't make this show or the Loud House any better whatsoever. In fact, it just becomes a lot more lifeless of the fact that these characters are just being in these scenarios and not having any second thoughts completely, which is what I see Ronnie Ann along with the other characters going trick-or-treating, where they stole all the candy from the Candy Goblin without having any other self-awareness of what could happen in the future, especially during Halloween. You know, if the Loud House didn't have that song sequence Tricked being sung by Luna, I can still guarantee you that this episode would still beat the Casagrandes episode regardless. It isn't because the song is great, but it's the fact that the plot itself can instantly handle without the song itself, which is further proof that the Casagrandes Curse of the Candy Goblin is mostly hopeless. The fact that it just makes me question the fact that, with it being a year old, it hasn't aged even in the slightest, unlike Tricked, which is 5 years old by this point. If we actually had the sequence of the maze without the song itself, it would still probably beat what the Curse of the Candy Goblin has. Because for me personally, unlike in Phantom Freakout or Ghost, it somewhat makes sense back there because it wasn't Halloween related. But since that this and the Curse of the Candy Goblin is Halloween related, it really makes the down-to-earth elements much more better than the fantasy elements that we witness in Curse of the Candy Goblin. And one of the reasons why I think that Sergio manages to do all this on his own is because it's mostly Halloween magic. There was no other way, even with the assistance of one of the birds that he interacts in this show, is willing to kill the entire costume along with moving the body and limbs of the Candy Goblin. There is no other way you can convince me that Sergio can be able to do all this on his own, even without the help of Carlos. If you ask me, it would have been a lot more surprising if Carlitos actually took control of the Candy Goblin, because he believes in Halloween spirits while the other characters just think otherwise. Granted, it would be a lot more predictable, but the way I see it, it just makes me convinced that if that was the case, then I'm pretty sure that Lily would have done the same thing in the Loud House if we did have a Halloween episode catered to her. With that being said, the Loud House's Halloween episode, Tricked, is the superior Halloween episode over the Casagrandes' Halloween Curse of the Candy Goblins episode. If you ask me, I'm not mostly surprised by this because after watching the Casagrandes' Halloween episode, I instantly knew that it was never going to top the Loud House's Halloween episode. Not only that this episode was a disappointment and an indication that this show is coming to an end, but this is also a missed opportunity to have a 22-minute episode centering around Day of the Dead, where Mexican people completely celebrate Halloween but during the festival. And for me personally, the Casagrandes did that in the very first season of the show. So it's honestly disappointing the fact that we ended up getting this Halloween episode instead of Day of the Dead celebration. Well, Mexican people just completely paint themselves as skeletons while wearing the same costumes in celebration of the festival. I just don't understand why they didn't do an episode catered to Day of the Dead, which could have been a great follow-up towards the season 1 episode. Because whenever I look at it, it really feels like that this could have been a chance to make a Casagrandes Halloween episode even better than the Loud House's Halloween episode, so that we can actually see the Mexican representation or the Italians representation of what they do during the Halloween season. But instead, we just get a generic Halloween episode, which is below the Loud House's Halloween episode. Anyway, that wraps up yet another Loud House vs. the Casagrandes project, with the Loud House getting a point with the episode rating an 8 out of 10, while the Casagrandes gets a 5 out of 10. And as for the next project centering around both shows, you already know what it is, and I'm going to be saving that towards the end of the year once we get into the Christmas season. I'm Lonely Fanboy 48 here, and I'll see you guys next time.